Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cordell Carter from the Aspen Institute Socrates program. I welcome you to yet another installment of our weekly webinar series. Today, we'll be talking about allyship from 4 Socrates alumni from all over the country. They represent different professions. They represent different age groups. They are from different parts of the country. Though this panel, I'm anticipating your questions here, is currently filled by people who identify as white, this is one of the most diverse panels and frankly, symptomatic of what you would see in an Aspen Institute seminar, people from very different parts of lives. So this is the first lesson is don't make assumptions based on what you see. I think we all wish that were true, right? So let me introduce this amazing panel. First, we have Haley Littleton. She currently manages communication and public engagement for the town of Breckenridge, Colorado. She has a master's degree from the University of Denver, where her research focused on literature's role in galvanizing and supporting large-scale social movements and the way narrative shapes our social and political behaviors. We also have Samuel Kimbriel. He is a political philosopher living in Washington, D.C. He's a noted author and is part of an emerging generation of communitarian thinkers and writes on themes of solidarity, ideology, power, loneliness, and trust. We also have Brenda Gerber Vincent. She is a speaker, author, and outspoken mental health advocate. Her passions include mentoring the next generation of leaders and creating quality and equity of place through economic development. She currently serves as Vice President of Community and Corporate Impact for Greater Fort Wayne Incorporated. And lastly, our moderator, Mr. Lincoln Ellis. He is a Senior Investment Strategist and Chief Investment Officer for Northern Trust Global Family Office and Private Investment Company Practice. In this capacity, Lincoln works with chief investment officers, investment staff, and their families on portfolio construction, asset allocation, manager selection, and program implementation. Lincoln is also tasked with managing investment programs for some of the firm's most important relationships. His group advises on or manages north of $80 billion USD in assets. Thank you all so much again for joining us. Lincoln, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Cordell, and thank you, as always, to the founders of the Socrates program at the Aspen Institute, with whom none of us would be possible, our patron saints, Laura and Gary Lauder. As many of you are aware, Socrates embodies a number of ideals that are crucial to our collectively navigating moments like the one our nation, and quite frankly, the world is undergoing. Open, honest, deliberative dialogue that moves to facilitate tangible, systematic, and sustainable action is what is at the core of the seminars and is what I hope will be at the core of our conversation today. We have a lot to cover in an hour. I think we'll be successful if we explore a few key issues with our panelists. First, how do you see the role of white people in facilitating sustained racial justice? What are the implications of this? And is that an ally? Second, why is this conversation worth pursuing? Is ally the right word? What are the potential complications of this? And third, and I think most importantly, what are we actually doing to further the goals of racial and social justice? A few opening comments from myself to set a bit of context, and then let's dive into this with our panelists. Thanks again, Cordell, for asking me to moderate what I think will be both a meaningful and useful discussion that links both ideas and action, a sort of core principle of what goes on at Socrates in both the summer and in the winter sessions. This idea side of today's conversation was located in a winter seminar that was hosted by Thomas Chatterton Williams, entitled Native Sons, the Pain, Rage, and Hope of America's Most Loyal Critics. The readings included were from Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and more contemporary folks such as Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Reginald Dwayne Betts. The action side of what we will talk about today, I think, is embodied in our recently lost great civil rights leader, John Lewis, when he suggested that at the right time, we should find ourselves getting into what he called good trouble. And so maybe we'll do a bit of that today. History, as it so often does, leaves us clues of what has worked in the past and how we might reimagine both the current and future states of our world. The freedom riders, to which Lewis is so tightly connected, are a great example, and perhaps some of what is meant by being an ally or allyship. The diversity of the Freedom Riders in many ways affirmed the importance of allies in the struggle for racial justice and equality, acknowledging that the support of some in the white majority was, in fact, certainly in the 60s, necessary to achieve legal and political rights. I want to bookend that and kick off our conversation with a paragraph that was written by Ernest Owens in Philly Mag a couple weeks after the George Floyd killing. Some of you may know Ernest's work from an op-ed that he penned just after the Amy Cooper, Chris Cooper Central Park confrontation, but I thought this piece quite useful to kick off our discussion. And the piece was entitled, "White People, Please Stop Declaring Yourself Allies." And he writes, "If we are to seriously combat racism, we need to be brutally honest about how white people should conduct themselves in this fight. For starters, we need to do away with the expected pats on the back, fancy labels, perhaps a reference to our topic today, and symbolic gestures, absolutely a tip of the hand to the black squares of Instagram." He continues, "Too many Black lives have been lost by the silence and complicity of well-meaning white people who may not have committed the criminal act, but who are guilty of looking the other way. You do not get credit for showing up 400 years late and now suddenly giving a damn because you're finally fed up. The option to care or not is the very definition of white privilege." And so, Haley, I want to start with you. Could you spend a few minutes describing how you have arrived at where you are today, your journey from the winter seminar, and then we'll go to Sam and Brenda for both.
Yeah, of course. I first would like to say thank you to everyone who is on and participating. First, a huge thank you to Cordell. Our relationship was jump-started when we met on an airplane talking about these topics. So it does feel full circle, and I'm sure a lifelong friendship. And then thank you to all my other participants who I've had the wonderful opportunity to interact with intellectually and personally through the Aspen. So, when I think about my experience with the Baldwin Seminar, and it was really an awakening, and not necessarily maybe in the intellectual sense, as these were ideas that I had been reading and ruminating on since graduate school. But it did really reinvigorate in me a commitment to continue to read critical race theory. And starting since January, I've been just devouring wide swaths of books about race and whiteness and abolition and political implications. And I've been learning so much context and nuance because of this. And really, as you talked about, wrestling with and processing how I am complicit. And personally, I've been focusing on two things. First is the myth of race neutrality, and the good and bad binary of racist perception. And so I grew up in the South. I now live in Colorado, but I spent all my formative years in the South. And but when I really think about my childhood, I don't remember many overt incidences of racism or honestly interactions with race, aside from some of my classmates in school or my teammates when I played competitive basketball. And there's a part of me that kind of wants to say, I grew up race neutral, but we all know, and I know that that's not true, especially coming from the South. We are constantly haunted by the past mythologies and current realities of what happens in the South. And, that's evidenced by the continued usage of the Confederate flag. So I think that I really grew up in a attempted race neutrality view, but in many ways it was simply de facto segregation and not having those interactions and relationships. On one hand, I can think I've never heard my parents speak poorly of anyone of a different race. But we also never talked openly about race. And I know that the ideologies and mythologies have seeped into me because as a kid, I can remember being very cautious and very intensely afraid of gangs, which was something pretty prevalent in my school and where I grew up. And so there was always this, what I've really wrestled with is there was this always undercurrent of fear of Black male bodies that I've had to personally wrestle with and root that out of my subconscious. And then I think back now and I think about how steeped I was in the lost cause narrative and the war of Northern aggression, I certainly remember that being in some of my school books, and, you know, conservative ideas about welfare recipients. And what really helped me kind of understand this notion is Kindi's notion in How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he talks about how we're all kind of caught up in this downpour of racist ideology, but we think we're dry. And someone comes and offers us an umbrella and a way out, and we can either choose to say, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm dry, or we can choose to say, wow, I had no idea that I was this wet. And that's been very true of my own journey in racial awakening. And, you know, while I thought that I grew up race neutral, I've really had, it's been a process of intellectually, personally, psychologically, emotionally sort of working back. And what I would say is, you know, accepting those umbrellas. And I've also, you know, realized how much the good, bad binary of racist perception has affected my understanding. And I do want to talk about more of this later, but it's the idea that I really grew up with, that only bad people are racist and good people are not racist. And so if I do something racist or I'm called out for doing something problematic, then I'm a bad person. And personally, you know, my own personal neuroses, I've spent a lot of time in my life trying to be the good person, if not the perfect person. And so I've had to really deconstruct personally this dualistic notion in both my sort of pre-racial awakening and post-racial awakening. And it's a continuum and a continuation. And like Brene Brown says, one of my favorite writers, that, you know, I'm here to get it right, not to be right. And I find myself repeating that mantra a lot. And even, you know, recently I've been analyzing my own sort of liberal white womanhood. And in an article that I recently wrote, and, you know, why I'm sometimes so reticent to even speak out. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with ingrained patriarchy. Growing up in a society where the subtext was always that if I was too opinionated, too loud, caused too much of a stir, was too ambitious, that I would be alone and I would never have a partner. And so for me, subconsciously, recently, I've realized in many ways that I've traded solidarity and integrity and justice for sort of false safety and false relationships. And I think right now that's currently the work I'm doing personally to really root that out. So, yeah.
Sam, talk us through your journey.
Yeah, thanks very much, especially to Cordell for convening this. I find the model of Socrates to be real inspiration and all kinds of other things that I'm involved in. So I'm really grateful for that. Actually, when I first was invited for this, I had some reservations about talking about this topic on a panel of people who are white. And so Cordell and I talked about it a little bit, and I found that the way that he articulated it is really compelling, and I wanted to begin there. So I think that the notion of allyship can be a challenging or problematic one in certain ways. The primary way is the sense in which it can seem like it has to do with a problem that is someone else's, that then I'm coming alongside to help in some way. And I think that notion on its face is directly wrong and problematic in really important respects. I lived most of my adult life in the UK. I went there for grad school and then stayed for a decade. And part of what that does is it gives you a real sense of clarity about what it means to have a home or to be from a place or be in a place. And that experience of being uprooted from realizing that you came from a place and then no longer having the daily tangible connection to it, I think was a very formative background experience for me. So as this conversation has built through the Socrates seminar, I think that's been one of the key facts that runs through my mind, is the sense that I think for many of the African-American writers we're reading in February, the sense of being from a place but it not being your place is a very significant factor. And that's where I want to say that I think for me, there have been two main sets of reactions over the past months in relation to COVID and in relation to the protests after George Floyd's killing. The first one is the sense that I think the white community is happy for this to come up occasionally above the surface, but then equally happy for it to subside back down. And I think that's one of the things that, if you care about this, it begins to feel very significant and important that that doesn't happen. I have a quote from Martin Luther King from just the 6 months before he was killed, in which he writes, so the achievements of the 60s, Civil Rights Act and so on, brought for African Americans, quote, a sense of achievement, but it brought to the white community a sense of completion. And the problem, he goes on, is that then when it's time to take another step toward overcoming a very traumatic history, quote, a firm resistance from the white community developed. And I think that's essentially a good way of telling the story since the 60s. And the question is it possible to have a different story? And I think that was essentially the point at which I found having this conversation compelling, is that there is something about the white community taking a very significant burden of responsibility to make sure this doesn't disappear under the surface. And to that effect, I want to bring up one other quote. This is from Frederick Douglass' famous 4th of July speech. So he says, "Be warned, a horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you this hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 million crush and destroy it forever." Now, Douglas's point, I think, is the one that hits me most centrally about allyship, which is that this is not a problem for African Americans. This is a problem for Americans. And the question of whether our country will thrive and be healthy has directly to do with whether we can confront the issues we're hopefully talking about today in a kind of honesty, but then also a kind of assertiveness and action. And I don't think that you can be an ally unless you recognize this is our problem directly here in our own lives, our own vulnerability, and our own country.
Thanks, Sam, very much. Brenda, just back from a ribbon cutting. Thank you for being part of our conversation today. Walk us through where you are.
Thank you, Lincoln. And again, thank you to the Aspen Institute and Cordell for giving us this opportunity and platform to talk about this important conversation. As Lincoln said, I just returned from a ribbon cutting, which felt good. It was our first one since February. I am the Vice President of Community and Corporate Impact for Greater Fort Wayne, Inc. And when it comes to the discussion on allyship, I feel like I have a stake in this both personally and professionally, both of which I have spent a tremendous amount of time exploring. Really, how is this impacting our community? For those of you who don't know, and probably most of you, Greater Fort Wayne, Inc. Our mission is to build a nationally recognized economy. And that sounds big. But the truth is that we're succeeding in that mission. For those of you who don't know, Fort Wayne, Indiana is the second largest city in Indiana next to Indianapolis. But we're also the third fastest growing metro in the entire Midwest. We've had positive migration numbers for the last 3 years. And this is all the while cities around us and states around us are losing people to the coast. We're proud to say that our community, while we have a long way to go, is making great strides. But we have a long way to go when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and equity. And Samuel just said, it's what's going to make us thrive. And we profoundly recognize that in order to continue this growth, it's not about recruiting. Yes, that's a big part of it, is that we're out there every day recruiting people to come to our community. But more than that, it's creating a quality of place, an environment where diverse perspectives are truly welcomed. They're valued and they're listened to. And we realize that if we're going to thrive and we're going to grow as a community, it's got to be about inclusion. In my opinion, our community has gotten comfortable with just checking the box. I've had, over the many years that I've lived in our community, I'm a 4th generation native of my community. And for the last probably 10 years of my professional life, I've received more calls than I can remember saying to me, we need a person of color on our board. And I'm quick to respond. Do you need or do you want? And do you need one or do you want seven? And it is one of my passions to change the narrative in our community. We must do better. It is no longer about checking the box, patting ourselves on the back, and feeling like we've done our part as far as creating diversity within our community. If we're going to continue to grow and become a nationally recognized economy, it has to be a place where all can thrive. And it's not just doing the right thing, which it is, but it's also good for business. There are so many studies that have shown that diverse communities are the communities where businesses are succeeding. It's truly a big part of people's success is to avoid blind spots, to have different perspectives at the table. So professionally, I kind of lay that out because it's what I do every day. I get up to try to figure out how we can build leaders in our community, how we can be recognized as a national economy, and how we can be one of the most diverse and inclusive communities in the country. Personally, I am a product of being raised in the Bible Belt, a very conservative, kind of Midwest mantra that we have long been known for. But I can tell you that we also pride ourselves on being kind people, and a place where I think that we're really trying to come to grips with the national conversation. I can tell you that personally, when I was around 6 or 7 years of age, I was in my grandfather's hospital room, and I remember vividly a Black nurse coming into his room, and he ordered that nurse to get out of his room. That memory is still burned in everything that I do. It has stayed with me my entire life. It truly had an impact on who I am and who I became. I went to high school here in our community, and my high school was one of the very first high schools that had busing. While I welcomed the kids from what we called the inner city, I recognized early on that the process and the procedures and the rules were all created by white people. That although they were picked up in the morning in their neighborhoods, they were brought to our high school probably 20 to 30 minutes away. And the buses left at 2:40 every day. So if anybody wanted to, from what we again considered the inner city, if anyone wanted to participate, say in the debate club or on the football team or any after-school activity, there was no ride home. There was no opportunity for after-school activities unless you had a way home. And I remember thinking then that if the white people had been bused into the inner city, which in my opinion would have never happened, but if it had, I am confident that they would have found a way for us to participate in after-school activities, and we would have found a ride home. Unfortunately, I've also been witness to many overt acts of racism in my lifetime. And I'm also very aware that I have benefited from a lifetime of white privilege. I want to point out that my daughter, Bailey Dar, is on this call this afternoon. My daughter lives in San Francisco and she works in private equity for TPG. And I've always said that I raised my children and then my children raised me. They both have opened my eyes to such important issues. My children simply would not allow me to hold on to my old patterns of thinking and behavior. I'm very thankful for the education that both of them on almost a daily basis have given to me. It has helped me to realign my thinking. It's helped me to understand my blind spots. And I thank them both for that education that they've given to me. I was invited to Aspen in February, and I really didn't know what I was getting into. All I knew that I wanted to go and I wanted to be a part of the conversation. I had my choice of several seminars, and I chose to take, in my opinion, what was the harder path. I knew that sitting around the table, it was not going to be easy for me to keep up with the debate of my peers. But I knew that this is where I needed to be as I sat around the table. And as I introduced myself within the first probably 20 minutes of the seminar, I remember thinking and saying out loud, You know, white people often don't enter into these conversations because we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing, so afraid of being labeled a racist that we won't say anything at all. And I remember one of my classmates sitting around the table piped up and she said, you know what? It's not about you being comfortable. And those words will live with me for a very, very long time. Aspen profoundly impacted my life. And after Aspen, I have done a very deep dive into the history of racism. Like Haley, I have read probably close to 20 books at this time. I have had more conversations than I can even count. And I realized how much my education failed me. And while my intent is good, and I do want to be an ally, I know that intent is not enough. I know that I'm confident that I'm in my ability to step forward, to be courageous. I know that I'm going to make blunders and I'm going to say stupid things and I'm not going to always do the right thing. But like in so many ways, I am ready and willing to step forward, to have these difficult conversations, to make it easier for those who come after me. I am ready to be a better ally for our Black community. I am ready to have these discussions, and I'm so appreciative of the Aspen Institute for giving us that opportunity today.
Thanks, Brenda. So I had a whole bunch of questions to ask everybody, but that sort of has put a whole different spin on the nature of the conversation. A couple of things that I think are worth highlighting, and Haley, maybe I'd bring the conversation back to you. One of the knocks on allyship and one of the knocks on sort of, whites rushing to the side of or looking to help in the way that Sam talked about the problem being somebody else's problem and we're here to fix something. And the experience that Brenda just described about white Americans needing to be and wrestle with being uncomfortable and no longer checking boxes or reading books or things of that nature, but actually getting out and doing things. Can you talk a little bit about the space where you are today, having moved through, done the work, the cognitive work to sort of think about ways in which you're now either actively pursuing or pushing within organizations that you're involved or lead, things that are both structural and sustainable. I think part of what, and then I'll be quiet, I think part of what was interesting in Brenda's conversation and certainly the history of post Jim Crow or Jim Crow post America is the thing that when you go back and read the history, it suggests is whites were very structural and sustained in their efforts to disenfranchise African Americans on a very consistent basis through today. And it's now what I often hear in these allyship conversations is that we need that now from white America, and the excitement that is felt in the post-George Floyd moment is that, as Sam referenced, there may be some sustainability to and less box checking of white America in their ability or interest in taking up the cause of social and racial justice. So, sorry, Haley.
No, that's great. A lot there. So much to say. I have really, really been focusing recently on sort of what are the emotional and psychological landscapes that we need to make this work sustainable and long-term. I think as we talk about, I had a conversation with a friend's mother who didn't really understand. And we were talking about the first civil rights movement. And, I was trying to make this point that perhaps, and, I could be wrong, we're still all, I'm very open to critique, but, perhaps in the first civil rights movement, white people sort of felt that sense of completion that we've mentioned. So we sort of changed the bare minimum, pat ourselves on the back, and allowed ourselves to persist in the racial ideology. And recently I've been thinking a lot about, I grew up in the church world as well. And, the literal Greek translation for the word repentance means to literally change one's mind. And I think that that's what we've missed, and that white people have a lot of repentance to do in changing their minds and how they respond. And so we can kind of talk more later about, in actuality, how we have those conversations. But for me, I think we're trying to have incredibly emotionally charged and nuanced conversations in a society that is so stunted in the language of emotion. And then that's really a process we have to go through. I mean, for me, I have been thinking just a lot about the disavowal of ego and defensiveness, and really, how do you identify that in someone you're trying to have a conversation with, especially some of my white family members and friends who disagree with me, but also myself, really quickly, I'll say one of my favorite quotations is from Ram Dass, the Hindu Harvard professor mystic that just passed away. And when he said, when someone gets me upset or frustrated, I'm delighted because I think, wow, now I get to work on myself. And for me, that is the constant emotional posturing that I try to take of, really asking those difficult questions of myself of, where do I still want to hold on to power? Do I want to do the work, or do I just want to be seen doing the work? Which I think is a key element that we have to ask ourselves. And am I willing to forego something for this cause? Like, am I willing to give up comfort, access, security? And do I want to be seen as the good person? And so for me, a lot of this sustainable effort comes from literally changing our minds, that sort of idea of repentance. Because if I can't be authentic in my solidarity and integrity, then I can't do that work, or I'm going to bow out because it's just too hard. So that's sort of where I've been tracking along this conversation.
Sam, what are you thinking about in terms of, sustainable, actionable, both, goals and items that you entertain, not just at a protest, not just at an inflection point, not just, on a Sunday when it's convenient, but on a daily basis? Is there a practice or something that we might be thinking about or beginning to conceptualize that would be useful? Some of the questions that we're getting in from our colleagues online have a lot to do with notions of empathy and culture and sustainability. A lot of the items that, in fact, Haley's just touched on.
So I'll make one philosophical point and then 3 practical points, because that's my training and probably addiction to make philosophical points. So the philosophical point is, I think it's the question of sustainability has, in my view, perpetually haunted us because we've wanted to locate the problem at a level that's too superficial. So if you think about the history of European racism as a whole, it shows up directly as a way of, so societies have been violent in all kinds of different contexts. That's been true throughout human history. What's unique about this style of violence is that it involves a systematic effort to make sure that the nations that win that contest can give systematic reasons for why their opponents are not human, and then reap the benefits of that justification in all kinds of ways. There's a text that I read that I think put it well, which is that in certain respects, it would have been better if European nations had come in and just said, we're doing all these things because we're stronger than you and we can't. There's no more justification than that, just straight. But instead, there's a dramatic creation of an entire vision of the world and of our species that it has to sink down as a kind of justification. Now, once you start thinking about it at that level, I think that you have to realize the degree of intervention that's needed is the degree of humanity. What does it mean to be part of a shared species and also to be part of a shared country? the question of community is, I think, the primary one in that regard. And that's why wanted to mention the Douglas quote, that it is a serpent sucking away at the community on which we all depend. It's not as though there's one vulnerable party and an invulnerable party. It's that everyone is vulnerable. I want to note 3 practical things. The first is that I think that there's a profound demand on leadership for people that end up in positions of responsibility in all kinds of different ways for the society. I have a friend, Brandon Paradise, who's a professor of law at Rutgers, and he spearheaded a statement after the Floyd killing that was put out by the law faculty, directly with specific, tangible commitments that their faculty is stating in public and to which they can be held accountable to in the next term. And I think that sort of idea of thinking through what the actual institutional responsibilities are that we hold, and then directly and very tangibly working in relation to those. That's I think one area of activity. A second is, I think there have to be long-term and much more robust efforts at relationship building than what we've seen so far. And those relationships, I think, again, to a point that we've made several times, I think that the challenge of those relationships needs to fall much more on the white community than on the African American community. So there was an excellent piece by Dante Stewart recently in the Washington Post where he was talking about his experience of trying to have this conversation with white churches and just how profoundly reluctant the white churches would be to carry the relational burden of that situation. And I think that has to be a place that white Americans need to be much more directly involved in saying, as Brenda was saying, taking more of the share of awkwardness and pain, because this is, again, a shared history. And then the third thing I would say is that, so I'm, a writer and academic and editor, all these kind of things. And one of the things in my own work that I think about a lot is that this is, so when we're talking about that initial harm, deciding to create an ideology by which you can say, this class is not human and therefore doesn't deserve shared right. What we're talking about is stakeholder. What does it mean to share the guiding community of a society? I think that the revoking of what it means to be a stakeholder needs to be addressed in very, very dramatic ways. It's one reason why I think reparations are absolutely essential. And reparations, I think, should be, the models that I like best are long-term investments like baby bonds that can enable the entire country to be sharing in the wealth of the society, which is immense. And secondly, I think real estate ownership programs of some kind have a kind of sustainability to them. But then the second point, that point I think a number of people are paying attention to. The second point is, I think, to pay attention to what it means to guide a society. And in particular, that means that African Americans end up taking a very dramatic role in saying not things about this select area of discussion, namely race, but about America as a whole. What is America? What is life? What is the society? What does it mean to be human? And taking a dramatic role. And I think I've actually been really pleasantly encouraged in certain ways during COVID. I think some of the best writing during this period about the pandemic and about society as a whole, about all kinds of things, not about specifically talking about race, have come from African American writers. And a few that I've really loved reading, Brandon Terry at Harvard, Keeanga Yamada Taylor at Princeton, Osita Wanevu and Esau Macaulay. All of those writers have been producing like superb things about life. And I think that capacity to have the shared stakeholder status is the thing that I think I'm especially interested in.
Taylor has a very powerful closing in a webinar that she did with Cornell West and a number of other colleagues in the Northeast that I think amplifies one of your more important points, and that is this notion that particularly in the conversation around allyship, where it is not about us trying to drag Blacks into white America, but it's actually reimagining America and what it means in all of its possibilities, which was really at the core of what your winter seminar was about. Brenda,
can I say
please.
One point on that? I mean, it's also the case that America really needs that. We're at a point in which reimagining is very, very significant deficit in our public life and our public discussion. And the capacity to have imagination and vigor and insight into what it means to be a human. I mean, that's a profound need that the society has.
Yeah, I liked the 3 points that you made around relationships, stakeholders, and leadership. And Brenda, you've certainly demonstrated from your seat a significant amount of leadership. I'm reminded and need to be held accountable too from our own, sort of corporate seats, that we're doing things on a sustainable basis when and where we can to allow access and power to communities who have traditionally been disenfranchised. One of the ways in which we've done that at Northern Trust is built a series of investment programs called Engage 360, whereby we have partnered with the University of Chicago to go out into the community and invest in minority-led and women-owned investment companies. And just as you were saying earlier, there's a ton of data that seems to support the success of those businesses, both as ongoing concerns and, more importantly, for those who allocate capital to them, investment returns, which we saw that cohort significantly outperform their peer groups in the very tumultuous periods of March and April. Can you walk us through a few additional items in terms of leadership and sustainability that you and your teams are engaged in? I think the sort of work that we are doing on the ground is super important.
Yeah, I can talk about some real practical initiatives that we have partnered with. And I do, after this, remind me, Lincoln, because I would love to piggyback off of Samuel about what is the white role. So after I get done with these initiatives, I'd love to come back to that to talk about kind of his 3 points of what is the stakeholder and what does that role look like. But with Greater Fort Wayne Inc., again, in our community, we are also the Chamber of Commerce. So we're the economic development arm in the Chamber of Commerce. So we partnered with our Black Chamber of Commerce, our Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and New Allen Alliance. New Allen Alliance represents 8 counties outside of the area. So we basically, what that means is that we've included everyone in our community through those different organizations. And we realized that we needed to do better, not only for our members, but for our community. So we really, as the organization that oversees and supports over 8,000 businesses, we had to sit down and we had to really decide what our lane was. Really, what was our lane as far as hiring practices? How do you create a culture in the business culture that thrives for all? What does it look like to do tax abatements and really looking at the structures and what can we lobby for? What policies on the state level can we lobby? So we really took a hard look into just these business principles that we could do a better job doing. So what we realize is there's a few organizations that are large enough to have the luxury of having a diversity officer on staff. So every day that person wakes up and just, is a wealth of information for businesses to help them navigate and guide through these very difficult conversations and kind of business, if we're going to realign and we're going to restructure, which COVID has greatly shown a light on all of the processes that were so fragile within the systems. So really looking at that from a business perspective, what we did is we're offering a webinar series, which we will launch at the end of this month. And we're going to do our first one on hiring practices. And we're going to invite organizations that do have a diversity officer on staff to be able to provide that information to smaller businesses within the community. We're also going to do roundtable discussions where we're going to invite CEOs and influencers within our community to sit in a very safe space to start having these conversations. And we hope to continue this, not just throughout this year, but into next year. I think we've made a commitment and we want to be held accountable as an organization that we're going to keep our foot on the gas. It's something that we're very passionate about. When you talk about supporting what we're calling underrepresented businesses within our community, we have a program called the Bridge Program. It just won a statewide initiative for innovation. And basically what we realized in our community is that we had a thriving corporate community and a thriving entrepreneurial community, but the two weren't connected. So corporate partners are basically adopting entrepreneurs. Our first cohort, we had over 10 female-owned businesses and minority businesses, and I'm really trying to take that word out of my vocabulary, but underrepresented Black and brown businesses that are now being kind of partnered with a corporate partner to be able to not only provide back office services, but also to provide support and guidance to really elevate their exposure, and hopefully we will create a faster runway to their success. We've committed that this next cohort of entrepreneurs will all be focused on underrepresented business owners within our community. So we're making really intentional efforts around very specific business focused initiatives that we hope, and we have we know that this is a start, and we also know that it's just a baby step. And we know that we have a long way to go, but our community is resolute in their decision that we're going to continue down this path to help businesses in our community have the resources they need in order to make the right decisions. That when we talk about inclusion for all, that it's no longer a checkbox, but it truly inclusion will mean understanding and valuing different perspectives. So we're excited about that. And now I'm going to kind of segue, if I can, Lincoln, just one more second, because it struck a chord with me when you talked about what is our role, because I piggyback on my own initiatives, right? So, as we're getting ready and we're partnering with the different partners in our community to bring these initiatives and launch them, it was one of those interesting things after the murder of George Floyd. I can tell you that many white businesses in our community, we all raced to put out a diversity statement. But before we put out that diversity statement, we probably sent it to 4 or 5 of our Black colleagues. And we said, hey, did we get it right? Did we have the right wording? Does this hit the right tone? Help us to navigate if this is the right thing to say. And several came back and said, look, this is your solution. This is your problem. You figure out the wording. You figure out what you want to say. You figure it out. So then, as a white woman in our community, bringing these initiatives and being the spokesperson for some of the initiatives that we're launching within the partnership, there's also this feeling of, why is this white woman leading this conversation? Which really has put me into a place where I wrestle with the fact of, what qualifications do I need to lead this conversation? What do I need to have in my skill set, repertoire, education? What do I need, or what do I need to obtain to have that credibility to be able, as a white woman, to lead these initiatives, knowing that in some minds it's my problem to fix, and in other ways saying you don't know what you're talking about. So I've really been wrestling with that in between of trying to understand exactly what that role looks like. So Samuel, I think you laid it out perfectly. You actually teed it up for me to talk about the things that are on my mind and on my heart as we continue to move our community forward.
And I think they really tap into a lot of what Haley was talking about earlier about being, egoless, open, honest, willing, and coming to the conversation, understanding full well that there are mistakes that will be made. And, it's a difficult time. I think about, Thomas Chatterton Williams's Harper's Open Letter, and this, kind of moment that we're in terms of cancel culture and things of that nature. But Haley, I wanted to give you the floor again to pick up on Brenda's conversation around, vulnerability and ego and how important that has been not only in your journey, but I think as a part of a broader whole when we're thinking about ways in which we can be sustainable in this moment of really, I've been migrating myself towards this notion of solidarity that Samuel brought up. You know, I use a scientific word, it feels better. So anyway.
Yeah, I would love to hop in. I did see in the Q&A there was sort of a question about how we, you know, on the more practical side, how we go about having these conversations, you know, to persuade people and convince them and bring them over. And that's something that I personally, professionally have thought a lot about. And I'm kind of doing a cognitive reframing of defensiveness in my own life. So I talked about it personally. But when I'm having these conversations with people, when I've got to the point where when someone gets really defensive towards me, instead of me being like reactive or fearful of, oh God, what did I do? I got to backtrack. I've really started to zero in on like, okay, apparently I've hit a nerve. This is interesting. Let's work that back. Let's unpack that. What do they feel like this is saying about their identity? What are they afraid of? And so, and if the person is willing to have that conversation, if they're willing to go there with you, it can be incredibly useful, because I think we forget how addictive neurological pathways against cognitive dissonance are. You know, those are incredibly addictive. And so what we're trying to do is trying to rework that. And so I really try to see if the person, you know, I in my brain, it switches to, wow, this person is so afraid of this revelation and what it means for their life that they're willing to literally believe anything to sort of steel themselves against that. And so how do we address that? And, you know, I would suggest everyone go and read the book Dying of Whiteness. I mean, it's incredible. It goes back to what Samuel's talking about, where literally our adherence and obsession with white supremacy is killing us. And there's public health data to support that. And so our America's not great either. Let's create a better one together. And then I would just really quickly say, you know, the difficulties of the misinterpretation of language. I think when we're having these conversations with people who maybe disagree with us, that knowing their ideological constructs can really be helpful in sort of tailoring their language to what they can understand. Because I think that we really sometimes get into this inner circle language that I've noticed with my friends and family members, that it just alienates them. They don't want to listen to me. They're not going to be persuaded. And so, you know, if I'm talking to some of my family members, I'm using the language of evangelical Christian theology, or I'm using, you know, different ideological constructs, because for me, I ask, like, do I want to convince them and persuade them, or do I want a villain to measure my self-righteousness up against, you know? And for me, like, that's where it always gets back to, of like, do I want to convert people? And this is not me suggesting we have unsafe conversations. There have been plenty of times where I'm like, okay, this is not going anywhere. You're not listening to me and respecting me. So I'm going to, you know, take a step back and try that again. But I do think that we can be very sort of critical of our own language and how we are trying to persuade people. So for me, it is really, in practicality, reframing that defensiveness and then restructuring the language of how I communicate with people.
We had, we have just a couple of minutes left. I wanted to sort of ask a series of you to sort of quickly touch on. I had a conversation with a friend yesterday about things that were important both on the sustainability front and on the structural side. And he shared with me sort of three ideas that he had been focusing on. And I like this idea of focus for a couple of reasons. One, it reminds me of something that one of my early mentors at Morgan Stanley, Fred Whittemore, said to me: be very focused in the things that you pursue. He was actually talking about philanthropic pursuits. And while this isn't philanthropy by any stretch of the imagination, it does beg the same kind of focus in terms of sustainability. He said the three things that he was thinking about is: one, access is key; two, that he wanted to see or think about ways in which more genuine representation could be had. And he didn't want to, we cautioned representation is not a reference to Brenda's earlier box checking exercise or one person on the board, right? And then finally, this notion of holding, and he said he hates the word, and I am less of a fan of it too, holding safe spaces. But what he was really talking about was places of refuge. And this really was a tip of the hand, Haley, to places of cognitive refuge. And he described, having come from the south side of Chicago, oftentimes going downtown as a teenage boy to go window shopping or to a museum, because these were things that he could do that would produce cognitive refuge for him from both the environment in which he was living and the racist society in which he was himself growing up. And so maybe, Sam, we'll start with you just on those three things quickly, because we are tight on time: access, representation, and refuge.
Okay, so I think I'll just state one thing in relation to all three, which is I think that the category of vulnerability is really key here. So I think one of the primary blocks that keeps structural changes on the side of the kind of decisions that white Americans are most empowered to be able to take, one of the main blocks that keeps them from taking them is an attempt to protect a vulnerability or a kind of power of some kind. So the example I have here is the way that COVID swept up on our shores and was by, sort of the fact that we're all physical beings means that we're all vulnerable to it. And then suddenly there was this very quick process by which the who actually carries the risk of that situation gets distributed throughout the society. And then we were able to find out, a month or 6 weeks later, that it ends up falling on African-American communities very, very disproportionately relative to white communities. That's the kind of pattern that has to change, and has to change very dramatically. That when there's a question of sorting vulnerability, that protecting your own at the cost of other people, those substantive decisions are the ones that matter. And I think they impinge on all three of these areas I'm talking about.
Brenda, thoughts on those three?
Yeah, you know what, I will go along and with the vulnerability. I mean, I know as we talk about access and representation, I mean, we talk about it a lot. We're not there. I mean, I don't think we necessarily, the team that I am lucky enough to serve on. I mean, these are all questions that come up every day, and every day they change. And every day we talk about, this isn't like this path isn't already, set for us. It's us having to navigate all of these different conversations around these really big topics. And I think back to Samuel with the vulnerability. I mean, I think for me that I am modeling that daily, by going in and saying, you know what, like, I'm not going to get it right, but I want to really try the best I can to understand and to learn and to listen and to do my best to help, at least in the position that I have professionally, provide opportunities again, for the access and representation. It's what I get up every day and what I'm doing. And I've committed again to the community that we're not stopping. This isn't, my biggest fear is that the white people are going to let the Black people down once again. Like, we keep saying all of these things and all of this rhetoric. And that's my biggest fear, is that we're going to go back to business as usual. And I can tell you that I can commit for myself and our team, we're not going to let that happen, at least not in our community.
Haley, can you wrap us up?
Oh, okay. I agree with the points that Sam and Brenda made. I also have been really liking viewing privilege as opportunity hoarding. So where am I hoarding opportunities? And where can I let go of that? I also just would really, really quickly love to reference that panel with Cornel West. He talks about how the genius of sort of structural racism is that we often turn around issues to white fears, anxieties, rather than Black suffering. And so for me, it's in all three of those things, how am I standing in solidarity that has nothing to do with me, but is just a bolster to the movement. And so that's where I would end it.
Thank you so much. I'm going to toss it back to Cordell Carter. I thought we would end just with one little piece again from our recently passed friend, John Lewis, that I think is important to leave this conversation with. He said, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. But most importantly, at the end of this quote, he says, you have to do something. And so I leave you and toss back to Cornell with this idea that we need to be doing things. Thanks.
Thank you, Lincoln. Thank you, Haley, Samuel, and Brenda. This was fantastic. And you all are doing something. And thank you for providing your personal narrative and journey today. At Aspen, we say a really good conversation has 3 parts. It's the conversation with the ancients, or the text, if you will. The conversation with your peers, which is what we've done here. But more importantly, the conversation with yourself, because that conversation doesn't end. And this conversation won't end. Ladies and gentlemen, next week, we're back with the second part of a 5-part series on a much larger conversation about our current times. It'd be Michael Aiken from Link Strategic Partners, Ayanna Parsons from Korn Ferry International, and Melissa Tidwell, the former general counsel for Reddit, talking about how corporations are dealing with the tension between performative actions versus normative behavior. So join us next week for that conversation that won't stop. Thank you again. We'll see you next time.